At 4:17 hours local time, a swarm of Ukrainian drones was flying at wave-top altitude over the Black Sea, 45 miles from Mysovoye. This was a fast boat base of Russia's Black Sea fleet, playing an important role in maintenance, resupply, and support for coastal patrols on the Crimean Peninsula. What the Ukrainian control crew did not know was that this attack contained more dangers than usual. After Ukraine carried out a 40-day campaign of attacks on Crimea, Russia had added a type of weapon to this port that no drone here had ever faced before. And whether this attack would succeed depended on a decision made on a Ukrainian production line several months earlier. 22 minutes later, the satellite receiver on the lead drone updated its position. Immediately, the data began drifting away from reality. The new position was completely wrong. On the navigation system display, some UAVs appeared to be flying 20 miles deep into inland Crimea. Others were pulled 40 miles south, and some even appeared to be turning back out toward the Black Sea. In reality, that was not happening. Nothing had changed. All the drones were still maintaining an altitude of 180 feet and a speed of nearly 180 miles per hour, skimming the sea surface and continuing directly toward Mysovoye. A jamming system on the coastline was transmitting high-powered spoofed satellite signals to overpower the real signals, providing every approaching drone with a completely inaccurate position and making them believe they had gone off course. It was like someone quietly replacing every road sign overnight. You continued driving according to what you saw, but the farther you traveled, the farther you moved away from the real road. But the AN-196 Lyutie was not designed to depend entirely on those signs. The moment the satellite signal began to become distorted, the control computer immediately switched to INS, Inertial Navigation System, mode, using flight data that had been preloaded before takeoff. The gyroscopes continued keeping the flight axis stable. The accelerometers recorded every smallest change in speed and altitude. From there, the computer reconstructed its position in real time without requiring any satellite signal. INS was not perfect. It still accumulated errors over time. But at this distance, a deviation of only a few hundred yards was not enough to divert an entire formation, targeting an area stretching along the coastline. Russia could jam, distort, and erase every navigation reference along Crimea's western coast. But the Lyutie swarm had never truly needed to look at them. On the coastline ahead, a Russian air defense operator from the 18th Air Defense Missile Regiment was scanning his search radar across 45 miles of open sea. Empty. He leaned toward the screen, still empty. 3 years had passed since the drone war began. No one on this coastline still believed that an empty screen meant a safe sky. But they also could not fire at something the radar had not yet identified. Along the coastline, other operators were staring at identical empty screens. All of them reached the same terrifying conclusion. Something was coming, and the radar could not tell them where it was coming from. If you looked at a Lyutie, that empty screen began to make sense. It was only 3 by 7 meters of composite material, plywood, and radar reflective reducing skin. Each one cost about $1,500, less than a new car, and more than 100 could be produced per day. A Russian interceptor missile cost $1.5 million, more than several UAVs in the formation combined. But what concealed them was not their cost. It was their altitude. At an altitude of 120 to 180 feet, the Lyutie swarm hid within the reflections from the sea surface and below the radar horizon. Ocean waves, seabirds, and small civilian vessels created thousands of flickering signals. A radar capable of detecting aircraft from hundreds of kilometers away could still miss a small object flying close to the water, 45 miles offshore. The operator had not done his job incorrectly. That morning, the laws of physics simply were not on his side. The Costa 2E2 low-altitude surveillance radar near Mysovoye continued scanning the area west of Crimea. A weak signal appeared amid the sea clutter, then disappeared. The next sweep detected 2 more signals. The computer tried to combine them into flight tracks, but only a few seconds later, all of them sank back into the background clutter. In only 90 seconds, the curvature of the Earth would no longer be able to conceal the UAV swarm. When they were 20 miles from the coast, the radar screen suddenly lit up. 4 signals, then 9. After the next sweep, dozens of tracks began forming into flight paths, heading directly toward Mysovoye. And at that exact moment, the Ukrainian formations split apart. 12 maintained course toward the pier and the fast boat anchorage area. 10 turned north, targeting the fuel depot and supply station. The remaining 10 circled south, heading toward the repair workshops and the patrol operations center. 3 attack axes appeared at the same time. On the Costa 2E2 screen, a single formation had just become 3 separate threats. Russia could not know which group carried real warheads. It could not know which group was the decoy. And most importantly, it could not know which one was the true primary target. The air defense system began operating at 0441 hours local time. Data from the Costa 2E2 was transmitted to the S-350 Vityaz battery, protecting the coastal corridor east of Mysovoye. The 50N6A fire control radar turned toward the Black Sea and began searching among dozens of flickering tracks. The combat crew had only a few minutes left, and the situation was far from simple. The S-350 could track multiple targets, but each interception still required a track stable enough for the radar to lock onto, calculate a trajectory, and guide the missile to the interception point. Imagine a switchboard with multiple lines, but more than 30 calls arriving at the same time, most of them continuously disconnecting midway through. The battery commander had to choose which targets deserved to be destroyed first. At that exact moment, 4 Liutis at the rear of the formation deliberately climbed to altitudes between 1,000 and 1,600 feet. Their signals immediately became clear. While the low-flying UAVs continued flickering amid the sea clutter, the 4 targets above appeared bright and stable. On the 50N6A screen, they looked like the easiest threats to deal with. That was exactly what Ukraine wanted. The battery commander observed the display for several seconds, selected the 2 nearest tracks, and gave the order to fire. 9 M96 missiles left their launchers. They accelerated almost vertically, leaving 2 white smoke trails above the Crimean coastline, then banked sharply toward the Black Sea. The first explosion tore the UAV into many small pieces. The second disappeared in a burst of fire above the sea. 2 targets were destroyed, but they were not carrying the main warheads. One carried only a small amount of explosives. The other was entirely a decoy, sent upward solely to create a radar signal that the S-350 could not ignore. Each one was worth about $50,000. Each missile used to shoot them down was worth many times more, but cost was not the most serious problem. While the 50N6A radar focused on the targets above, most of the Liuti swarm maintained altitudes between 120 and 180 feet and continued racing toward Mysovoye. The low signals appeared and disappeared. One emerged between 2 waves. Another vanished into the reflected clutter from a civilian vessel. On the screen, they did not remain visible long enough to create a reliable firing solution. The S-350 crew shifted to the next group of targets. 2 more Liutis climbed again, providing additional bright, clear tracks that were almost impossible to ignore. 2 more missiles were prepared. That was the entire trick. The S-350 had been built to intercept fighter aircraft, cruise missiles, and dangerous high-value targets. Now, it was being forced to use expensive interceptors against plywood airframes sent upwards solely to be shot down. Each launch meant 1 fewer Russian missile available to counter the next threat, and the threat the commander truly feared had still not appeared. The S-350 won each individual interception. Every target it locked onto was destroyed. But the number of tracks on the screen still did not decrease, because for every high-flying Liuti that was shot down, many others were still skimming the sea surface beneath it. At 4:43 hours local time, the group of 24 heading toward the pier was less than 12 miles from the coast. The northern group was approaching the fuel depot from another angle. The southern group had circled outside the main scan area and was advancing toward the repair workshops. The 3 attack axes forced each defensive element to fight within a separate area. No one could see the entire battle anymore. On the S-350 display, the The two high-flying tracks had just disappeared, but beneath them, the low-flying Liuts had passed through the first defensive layer. The Russian battery had won every engagement in which it had participated, and it was still losing control of the battle. 5 minutes later, the final short-range defensive layer saw them. About 8 miles from the Mysovoye pier, two Tor M2 systems were positioned behind sand dunes and low coastal structures. From there, they protected the fast boat anchorage, the fuel depot, and the workshops located deeper inside the base. The Tor M2 was not built to search for targets far out at sea. It was built for the final minutes, when the threat had come close enough that there was nowhere left to hide. When the first Liuchi crossed the coastline, the Tor radar immediately detected 3 tracks flying close to the water. They appeared for only a few seconds amid the reflections from the waves, but at this distance, a few seconds were enough. The combat crew opened fire. 9 M338K missiles rose vertically from their launchers, accelerated upward, and then turned sharply toward the Black Sea. The lead Liuti was hit at a range of nearly 8 kilometers. The warhead exploded directly in front of the UAV's nose, sending fragments through the wing and engine. The airframe rolled sideways and broke apart when it struck the water. The second disappeared a few seconds later in a large column of water. The third pulled its nose upward, attempting to escape the low-altitude engagement zone. That was a mistake. At an altitude of more than 1,000 feet, its signal became clear and stable. The radar maintained its lock, and the third missile left the launcher and destroyed the UAV before it could pass the defensive position. 3 targets, 3 successful interceptions. Unlike the S-350 behind it, the Tor M2 did not need to track a target for an extended period. It only needed to see the UAV for a few seconds, calculate the interception point, and place the missile exactly where the target was about to fly. Russia had finally brought the right weapon to the right battle, but there were only 2 Tor M2 systems, and the Liuchi swarm was approaching from multiple directions. One group continued skimming the water, another circled north, using sand dunes, warehouses, and the uneven coastline to conceal the final part of its approach. The remaining targets repeatedly appeared and disappeared, forcing the combat crews to shift their radars from one direction to another. 2 more missiles left their launchers. One UAV exploded in midair. The other was struck in the wing and spiraled down near the coastline. The Tor M2 continued shooting down every target on which it could maintain a lock. But during the seconds when the radar shifted toward another direction, the group flying close to the water passed the first sand dune. The distance fell below 5 miles. Behind the UAVs was no longer open sea. There were homes, warehouses, supply stations, and structures located close to the base. A missile that missed could continue beyond its target and fall into the very area the Tor M2 had been assigned to protect. The firing angles began to narrow. One track appeared behind a sand dune and then disappeared. Another target emerged above the base, but its flight path placed a residential area directly behind it. The missile could reach it, but there was no longer enough space to fire safely. A skilled crew, the right system, but the wrong geometry. By 0448 hours local time, the lead Liutis had passed through the short-range defensive layer. Ahead was the fast boat anchorage. To the left was the fuel depot. To the right were the repair workshops. Russia had found a weapon capable of shooting down the Liuti, but Ukraine did not need the Tor M2 to fail during every interception. They only needed a few UAVs to break through. Ukrainian mission planners had calculated this moment before the UAV swarm ever left the production line. The Liutis did not split formation only to attack multiple targets. They were dispersed to force each layer of Russian air defense to fight under the most unfavorable conditions possible. Those flying close to the water hid below the radar horizon. Those circling through the sand dunes forced the Tor M2 systems to keep changing direction. If only a few broke through, the battle would move inside the base, where Russian boats and structures began obstructing the very defense systems protecting them. At 0451 hours local time, the lead Liuti rushed through the entrance of Mysovoye harbor. The AK-630M gun on a support vessel immediately turned toward the target. The MR-123 Vimpel radar detected the UAV when it was nearly 3 kilometers from the pier. 630mm barrels began spinning, nearly 5,000 rounds per minute. The lead Liuti had its wing torn away and broke apart before reaching the harbor entrance. The second tried to veer toward the breakwater, but another AK-630M shot it down less than 200 meters from the seawall. 2 targets, 2 almost instant kills. At this range, the AK-630M had enough speed to catch the Liuti. But inside Mysovoye, space became the problem. Fast boats were packed tightly along the pier. Behind them were support vessels, fuel trucks, cranes, storage tanks, and repair workshops. One Liuti dropped close to the water and raced along the row of moored boats. The radar still held lock, but the line of fire passed directly through 2 patrol boats and a fuel tanker. The gun could not fire. The UAV disappeared behind a floating dock and then reappeared on the other side, nearly 1 kilometer closer. Another dived from above the workshop roof. The electro-optical system clearly saw the engine, but the pier and technical personnel were directly behind the target. The gun barrel followed, held lock, but did not fire. At sea, missed rounds would fly into empty space. Inside the base, every missed round would continue toward a ship, fuel storage area, or structure. Russia was trying to protect. The low-flying Liuti group continued using vessel hulls and piers as cover, while the northern group dived toward the repair area. One AK-630M fired for 2 more seconds. A UAV was struck by fragments and fell between 2 piers, but the rest of the burst continued flying toward the structures behind it. The ceasefire order was issued. The radar was still operating. The guns still had ammunition. But the safe firing angles were disappearing. Mysovoye had been built to maintain, refuel, and shelter fast boats. It had not been designed to conduct an air defense battle among moored vessels. The AK-630M could tear a Liuti apart in seconds, but it could not shoot through the very ships it had been assigned to protect. At 04:53 hours local time, the remaining Liutis were only about 5 kilometers from the target area. On the coastline north of the base, the Repellent 1 electronic warfare system began operating. The directional antenna array turned toward the harbor entrance. The receiver scanned the frequency bands commonly used to control UAVs, transmit data, and send images back to the operators. A signal appeared. The Repellent 1 determined its bearing, concentrated its power on that exact area, and covered the transmission link with a layer of radio interference stronger than the real signal. The first communication channel disappeared, then the second. Within only a few seconds, numerous radio signals advancing toward the base went silent simultaneously. On the Russian crew's screen, it looked like a victory. No more control data. No more transmitted images. No operator could see the target ahead or command the UAVs to change direction. The Repellent 1 had done exactly what it was designed to do. It separated the drones from the people controlling them. But these Liutis had entered the final phase of their mission. The coordinates of the pier, fuel depot, and repair workshops had already been stored in their memory. When the link disappeared, they did not turn back, slow down, or attempt to reconnect. They continued flying along the designated corridor. The INS brought the UAVs close to the target area. Then the image processor began doing the rest of the work. The forward camera scanned the breakwater, warehouse roofs, and the shapes of the piers. The computer compared what it saw with the map stored before takeoff. A section of the breakwater confirmed the direction of approach. A long roof helped correct the accumulated error. The angle between 2 piers determined the location of the anchorage. The Liuti did not need to know its exact position on a satellite map. It only needed to recognize what was in front of it. The Repellent 1 continued transmitting interference. The antenna shifted from the group of UAVs at the harbor entrance to those circling from the north. Its power increased, covering the area with electronic noise. But by then there were no transmission links left to overpower. One Liuti passed behind a warehouse and then reappeared above the water, heading directly toward the refueling area. Another circled around the floating dock. Its camera recognized the outline of the pier, compared it with the stored image, and adjusted several degrees to the left. On the Repellent 1 screen, the radio channels remained completely silent. The Russian crew believed the UAV swarm had been separated from its operators. They were correct, except that it no longer mattered. The repellent one had successfully cut the link between the Leuti's and Ukraine, but the UAVs advancing into Mysovoye no longer needed that link. They continued flying in silence, no communication, no waiting for commands, relying only on the stored map and what the forward camera could recognize. By 04:55 hours local time, the lead drone could see the pier area through the spreading smoke. The Russian patrol boats that were still combat-capable immediately switched to the final defensive layer they had. The PK-10 decoy launching systems began firing. Small rounds left the launchers in salvos, exploded above the water, and released radar-reflective metal strips, infrared flares, and thick clouds of smoke. Within only a few seconds, the anchorage became a chaotic wall of light and heat. On the Leuti's sensors, dozens of bright points appeared simultaneously. The flares burned hotter than the engine of a boat. Smoke concealed the outline of the pier. Metallic interference strips drifted between the vessels, creating false signals along every approach direction. Behind them, the fuel depot that had just been struck continued burning fiercely. Columns of hot smoke rolled across the base, turning the entire infrared image into a flickering bright area. If the Leuti simply headed toward the strongest heat source, it would fly directly into the fire, but that was not what the computer was searching for. The processor did not ask which object was the hottest. It asked whether the scene ahead matched the stored map. A long, low building appeared on the left side of the screen. It was the boat repair workshop. Behind the smokescreen, the outline of the floating dock lay parallel to the breakwater. On the right, the distance between the main pier and the refueling station still matched the mission data. The false bright points continued moving, but those structures did not. Decoys could create heat. They could create smoke. They could even make the sensors see more targets than actually existed. But they could not move the entire pier. They could not change the position of the floating dock, and they could not recreate the shape of the entire base. The first Leuti ignored the flares falling into the sea. It identified the cluster of storage tanks behind the refueling station, adjusted its course by several degrees, and began descending. The second saw the roof of the central workshop through a brief gap in the smokescreen. Target lock was confirmed. The remaining UAVs continued flying deeper toward the anchorage. Their sensors compared the length of the pier, the positions of the cranes, and the distance to the breakwater to locate the group of fast boats concealed behind the smoke. The PK-10 was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It filled the sky with false targets. But the Leutis were not searching for a bright point in the sky. They were searching for a location on the ground. And no matter how many decoys the Russians launched, Mysovoye remained exactly where the map said it should be. At 04:57 hours local time, Mysovoye's final defensive line detected the targets. A Gibka-S vehicle near the repair workshop turned its sensors toward the pier. The system carried Verba missiles with a range of 5 miles and was designed to intercept low-flying targets. But the Leuti UAVs were not approaching from the open sea. They emerged from behind the warehouses, cranes, and fuel tanks only a few hundred meters from the target. The combat crew had less than 5 seconds to react, classify the target, obtain an infrared lock, and fire. One Leuti passed over a warehouse roof and became clearly visible against the sky. The heat signature from its piston engine was sufficient for the Verba seeker to lock on. The missile left the launcher. It raced upward, turned sharply, and exploded directly in front of the lead UAV's nose. Fragments scattered outward and the airframe fell into the open space between 2 warehouses. One target was eliminated, but there were more behind it. The second Leuti descended, disappearing behind the workshop roof. The Gibka-S lost its lock for 3 seconds. When it reappeared, the UAV was already directly above the pier, too close to intercept safely. The defense switched to ground fire. The 12.7mm cord opened fire in short bursts at a rate of 600 rounds per minute, with red tracers tearing through the space between the cranes and warehouse roofs. Rifles from positions around the harbor also opened fire simultaneously at a bright point racing through the smoke. At this distance, the sound of the Leuti's engine could be clearly heard beneath the gunfire, a dry, steady sound like a lawnmower running at full power. And with every second, it grew louder. The first burst passed behind the target, the second cut above the wing. The UAV did not change direction. It dived toward the refueling station beside the main pier. The first explosion tore apart the pipelines and pumps. Fuel spilled across the concrete surface, ignited, and then spread toward the tanker trucks parked nearby. Within seconds, a wall of fire stretched along the supply area. The next Liuchi appeared from the south. It flew so low that it was concealed by the boats at anchor. The Gibka-S crew saw it only when the UAV pulled its nose upward to clear a crane. There was no longer enough time to launch. The cord machine gun changed direction. The rounds tore through the tail section, but not enough to bring it down immediately. The UAV shook violently, then continued toward the maintenance workshop. Inside were fast boats positioned beside disassembled engines, repair equipment, and spare parts storage. The warhead exploded in the middle of the work area, blowing away the roof and driving metal fragments through the vehicles parked close together. Mysovoye still had many intact boats, but the place used to repair them had just disappeared. The third Liuchi approached from the north. It disappeared behind the PK-10 smokescreen, emerged between two buildings, and then corrected its course toward the Patrol Operations Center. The air defense crew had only a few seconds. Another Verba missile was prepared, but behind the target were the workshop, communications antennas, and an area where Russian soldiers were moving. If the seeker lost its lock or the missile went off course, the base itself would lie in its path. The launch order came too late. The Liuchi crashed into the eastern section of the operations building. The explosion destroyed the communications room, broke the antenna arrays on the roof, and severed the link between the base headquarters and the coastal patrol units. In less than 3 minutes, Mysovoye lost 3 important capabilities: refueling patrol boats, repairing and maintaining vehicles, and coordinating missions along the Crimean coastline. That was what made this attack more dangerous than the number of boats destroyed. Ukraine did not need to sink every vessel at the base. An intact boat without fuel could not leave the pier. Another with a damaged engine could not return to service without a workshop. And even those ready for combat became less valuable when the operations center could not communicate or assign patrol areas. Smoke continued rising above Mysovoye. Below, many fast boats were still afloat, but they were trapped between the burning pier, the destroyed workshop, and the supply system that had stopped operating. Russia had protected most of the vessels, but it could no longer protect what made them a fleet. If you believe that precision operations can help Ukraine regain security and bring peace closer, leave the comment, "I choose peace." Like the video and subscribe to Military Observers to follow the next.